Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi. Welcome to Layout Building. In this episode, I'm going to talk about building the benchwork for our N-scale Siren Creek project layout. I'm going to be using power tools in this episode. I'm sure a lot of you already know how to use power tools safely, but I want to say this anyway, so please bear with me. When you're using a power tool, always make sure to pay attention to what you're doing, where your hands are, and where the saw blade or drill bit or whatever part of the tool that can possibly injure you is. Always make sure that your focus is 100% on what you're doing when using a power tool. Power tools are wonderful time savers, but they have to be used properly. No model train or layout is worth getting injured over. When I edit video, I try to keep up a certain pacing to keep things moving along. That might make it look like I'm working really quickly, but that isn't the case. I leave out the boring in-between parts where I'm setting up for the next cut or to drill the next hole. When I work, I'm actually very methodical and careful, especially with power tools. Please be safe out there. Our N-scale Siren Creek layout is designed to be small enough that Nichole and I can take it with us when we travel in our RV. It's also a way for me to do some model railroading while I'm waiting for the train room for my future HO scale layout to be completed. In the last episode, I talked about how I came up with the track plan and concept for the layout. The next step is to take the plan and start turning it into reality. I plan to use what's sometimes called cookie cutter construction for this layout. The track will be laid on a plywood top. I'll cut out the harbor area and drop that piece of plywood down lower to make a base for the water area. The plywood will have a grid made of dimensional lumber underneath for support. I also plan to make a decorative wood fascia for the outside. As with many construction projects, building starts with a good solid foundation. This is one area where it pays to use quality materials. Using poor quality wood is kind of like building an expensive fancy house on a crumbling foundation. No matter how nice it looks, it's going to have issues. Cheaper plywood can be rough and is often warped. The edges can be frayed. Higher quality plywood is more expensive, but it will be flat and have a smooth surface. Especially in N-scale, having a nice flat base to put the track on is important, as any warps can cause issues when the trains are running. The dimensional lumber I'm using for the grid is a good quality wood that the store called Select Pine. I found this in the area of the home improvement store where they keep the nicer wood. It's straight, mostly free of splinters, and has a consistent, smooth finish. For this layout, I'm going to start with the plywood top and then build the grid under it. That's not necessarily how I do things for a larger layout, where I'd normally build the supporting structure first, but it makes sense to me for this one. The overall dimensions of the layout are 48 inches by 29 inches. This is a 4x8 sheet of plywood, so the short side is already 48 inches long. The layout is going to be 29 inches wide, so I'll measure 29 inches from one end and make marks in several places. I'll connect my marks with a straight edge. This will be my cut line. Now I have the basic tabletop for the layout. The next step is to transfer the track plan from my drawing to the plywood sub-roadbed. Since I don't have a convenient way to enlarge the drawing or project it, I'm going to have to do it the old-fashioned way. The plan calls for curve radii between 8 and 12.5 inches. I've made a crude compass from a piece of scrap wood. I've drilled one hole at 0. That will be the curve center. I've drilled more holes at 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12.5 inches. The main tracks running down the sides of the layout are set back 2 inches from the edge. I'll measure 2 inches from the edge and make marks in several spots. Again, I'll use a straight edge to connect the marks. This will be my track center line. On the tunnel side, the standard gauge track is set back 1 inch from the edge. I'll measure and mark the track center line. Now I can measure 11 inches from that line and 11 inches from the line up the side to get the approximate curve center. I'll mark that with an X on the plywood. Once I've determined the center, I can draw the curve with my compass. It took me a couple of tries to get the curved entrance to the passing track right. On the plan, I drew the outer track as a 12.5 inch radius, but drawing it that way made the separation between the tracks too gradual. Eventually, I figured out that I could draw a second 11 inch radius curve for the outer track. Both come together at the turnout, but spiral out to my desired 1.5 inch track separation after 90 degrees. To make sure that my turnouts aren't too sharp, I can use a ruler. To make a number 6 turnout, I'll measure 6 inches in length. Then I'll measure 1 inch of separation. Drawing a line between them ensures that the turnout will have the correct geometry. I'm using my arm as a compass to draw a more sweeping curve from the narrow gauge tunnel on the bridge side. Now I've got most of the track center lines drawn. I've also drawn in roads in the rough outline of the harbor. Sorry about all the erasures, but it's better to make changes now with a pencil before getting out the saws. On a small layout like this, every square inch counts, so it's important to make sure things are in the right places. It's important to consider the key structures on the layout when mocking things up. This is a Muir Models Tuolumne Train Repair Shed kit that I've had since I was a kid. I started it but never finished it because I never had anywhere to put it. Now that I've decided to use it on this layout, I need to make sure I measure it accurately. The structure is about 4 real inches wide and about 3 inches long. Most importantly, I can measure from the edge of one door to the edge of the other and use that to get the track spacing, in this case 1 5/8 inches. I can transfer this dimension to the layout when drawing the shop tracks. Some of these structures, like the bridge and freight house, will be used on the layout. Others I'm not sure about, but they still make good placeholders to plan my town area. Most of the streets are a scale 24 feet wide, or about 2 real inches. I narrowed the street that will eventually lead to the waxworks slightly since it will need to skirt the hillside. I've had to make a few minor changes from my drawing. I have 2 different types of tunnel portals from Chooch that I want to use. I'll use one type for the standard gauge line and the other for the narrow gauge to give them a slightly different character. After test fitting them, I found that the portals closest to the location of the depot were a little too close together. I moved the narrow gauge curve here so that there will be more space between the 2 tunnel portals on the narrow gauge and standard gauge lines. The track arrangement going into the shop is slightly different. Both turnouts now come off the curving track that goes to the wharf. I also adjusted the spacing of the turnouts so that there's enough room for a driveway to pass over the narrow gauge tracks to access the freight house. I wanted to make sure that no switch points would be buried in the pavement. The plan as drawn had an optional track to connect the layout with a possible extension. I've opted not to build the extension for now, so that track will go away. Here's the revised plan, which I'll call Plan 14. None of these changes should affect the way the layout operates. It's just a lesson in the fact that things sometimes work a little differently in real life than they do on paper. Even though I'm now pretty certain that the tracks are all in the right places, I'm spending some more time test fitting structures and equipment. Putting some box cars around the freight house is a good way to see the cars in relation to the structure and track centers. I think this looks pretty good. Even if some of these structures won't ultimately be on the layout, I want to get some idea how much space similar structures will take and how the structures look in relation to one another. The location of the drawbridge is especially critical, since that will determine where I need to cut the wood to make the harbor. Now that I'm absolutely sure where I want the water to go, I can use my jigsaw to cut the plywood. I'm using a clean cut blade. It's a little slower, but it makes a nice cut that requires less sanding to remove splinters later. Since this is cookie cutter benchwork, I'll save the cutout piece so I can use it later at the bottom of the harbor. Now I need to make some supports. I have some 1x4 select pine that I'm going to use under the edges of the plywood. I'll do the ends first. I'm cutting each piece to 29 inches to match the width of the plywood top. I've heard woodworkers say that you can never have too many clamps. I'm inclined to agree. With some clamps set to keep the end in place, I'll drill some holes with a countersink bit. Then I'll use some 2.5-inch construction screws to attach the pieces permanently. The next step is to install some longitudinal supports. My benchwork plan shows one piece of wood running down the length of the layout, set off center to clear the harbor. I'll measure where this needs to go and then mark a line using a level as a straight edge. I'm marking it on top to make sure I'm placing the wood in a spot where it won't interfere with the switch machines. It's not always possible to avoid the turnouts entirely. In those cases, I'm making sure that the support location is under the frog, which has no moving parts, as opposed to the switch points. Now that I know where the support is going, I need to flip the layout over. I'll measure so that I can cut the support to fit between the 2 end pieces. I'll remeasure and draw the line again on the bottom. I've placed the support with one edge along the pencil line. A speed square is a handy tool to make sure that all the pieces meet at 90-degree angles. Now that I'm satisfied with the placement, I'll use clamps to hold the support. Since I want to make sure not to split the wood, I'm using my countersink bit again to pre-drill the screw holes. Once I have one screw in place, I'll use my square to draw a line to make sure my second hole is also centered. Now that the center support is attached, I can remove the clamps. I'm setting the front and rear edge supports about 1/4 inch from the edge of the plywood. I'm doing this so that I can leave room for a thin 1/4 inch plywood spacer. As with the center support, I'll pre-drill and countersink the screw holes. I flip the layout right side up again. Now I can use the line I drew to put some screws into the center support from the top. This is what the benchwork looks like with the supports in place. Eventually I'll need to cut the edge support at the harbor mouth down a little, but I'm going to hold off doing that until later. I've added some 1x2 bracing under the harbor area. I originally planned to add more bracing in this area, but the layout feels solid enough that I don't think I'll need it. I've marked a location on the center support on each side of the layout. I'm going to drill a hole here for electrical wires. I'm putting these at the ends of the layout because there aren't any turnouts or other moving parts in these areas. Especially with such a small layout, it's important to think about the placement of under-the-table wires and components. I'll start by drilling a small pilot hole. For this next step, I'm going to use a Forstner bit, which is good for making neat holes. I'll put the pointed center of the Forstner bit into the pilot hole and drill partway through one side. Next, I'll use my angled drill to get into the small space on the other side and drill from the opposite direction. This should minimize any splinters. The bit cut the hole pretty cleanly, so I'll just need a light sanding to finish up. The basic bench work for the layout is now complete. This is a good place to leave things for now. I'm pretty happy with the way the bench work is coming along. Next time I'll work on adding a fascia. Thanks for watching.